Norman?
Well, it's about basically one of Mrs May's key red lines, namely getting out of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, because Euratom, this European regulator, comes under the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. Now, as we know, Mrs May has said very, very clearly, part of Brexit is ensuring that it is British courts that decide, and for that reason, she believes we have to leave Euratom and set up our own agency, which would come under the authority of British courts. Now, why this matters is because, one, there are all sorts of potential practical implications in terms of the nuclear industry in Britain, in terms of retaining jobs here, but above all, concerns about what the impact might be on the import of medical isotopes used for scans and treatment in cancer medicine. And the fear is that if we leave, that could be compromised. So the question is how far Mrs May is prepared to take those risks in order to stick by her red line of ending the authority of the European Court of Justice.
Does she face a potential rebellion on her own backbenches on this issue?
She absolutely does. I mean, there was a debate in Westminster Hall yesterday, and I was struck by the range and number of Tory MPs who have deep, deep worries about what this is going to mean. And interestingly, even some Eurosceptics, Sir Bill Cash, saying, look, we're going to have to find a solution to this, because this is a problem that is going to crop up again and again and again. Take, for example, the issue of EU nationals. Who is going to actually enforce their rights? Again, is it going to be the European Court, or is it going to be British courts? And that sort of conflict is going to come up repeatedly. His suggestion was you should come up with some sort of tribunal system where you had British judges sitting alongside European judges. But this sort of tension, trying to resolve which court has authority, is going to be central to the sort of whole Brexit process. And we're now seeing the sharp end of it with the debate over Euratom.
It's quite a good example, is it not, Norman, of something that's never been high profile, but is incredibly complicated to resolve, whichever way we go, and incredibly complicated within the timetable, because the Article 50 deal, although it doesn't get implemented if it's done until March 2019, it'll have to be agreed around November of 2018 for ratification. And it's quite hard, they must be thinking in Whitehall, to get all this done by then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is absolutely spot on. What is interesting is we've just had the government's position paper on Euratom, and what they're basically proposing is a transitional phase. And it seems to me Brexit is now moving into transition time, because all these sort of difficulties are piling up. And as Mr Barnier said yesterday, the clock is ticking, and boy is it ticking, because he basically wants this sorted by the autumn of next year. We've got this great hulking repeal bill about to be published, all sorts of problems and difficulties ahead on that, if it can be passed at all. And then queuing up behind that, you've got 7 other bits of Brexit legislation, and frankly, almost no one believes it's going to be possible to do in that time frame. So the only way the government can do it is to buy themselves some time. How do you do that? You start talking about a transitional period. The difficulty, if you talk about a transitional period, it's like sort of just throwing a match into the Tory backbenches. It'll just go woof, because Tory backbenchers take the view, if you're talking transition, you're basically maybe just trying to scupper Brexit by talking ever and ever further off before we eventually leave. In effect, a bit like the CBI, talking about this unending process of transition. But that, it seems to me, is what the government is going to have to be forced down if it's to get any of this through.
Following this all right? It's quite complicated, isn't it?
Conclusions I would draw. First of all, our negotiating strategy is a mess. Secondly, the prior decision by Theresa May that the European Court of Justice would have no justiciability and no further relevance after Article 50 was concluded has had a whole series of consequences that weren't fully anticipated at the time. Don't take my word for it, take David Davis's word for it. He was as surprised as anybody that a red line was drawn on the ECJ. And thirdly, I'd really echo the point that Ed made, which is, frankly, whether it is the European arrest warrant, whether it is Euratom, there are common sense solutions that can emerge, but are in tension with a dogmatic approach that says the ECJ is an absolute red line. And ironically, exactly as you suggest, Andrew, one of the consequences, if the ECJ gives way to a growth industry of new regulatory bodies and judicial oversight, will be vastly more bureaucracy, work, regulatory bodies and work for lawyers in Britain, hardly the deregulatory initiative that many Brexiteers were hoping for.